I didn't wake up expecting to see bulldozers on my family's historic ranch, yet there they were, roaring like beasts in a feeding frenzy, steel jaws grinding into the soil that held generations of my family's sweat and memory. At first glance, I thought they had mistaken my property for a public construction site, but then I noticed the sign, a glossy, oversized billboard proclaiming the future site of 42 luxury condos, courtesy of Pleasant Trails Homeowners Association. 42 condos on my ranch? I nearly choked at the boldness. The shock hit me so hard my breath caught in my throat. In that very moment, a single question blazed in my mind. How far would they go, and how could I possibly stop them? I couldn't fathom the scope of their plan, not yet, but I was determined to find out. Little did I know this was only the tip of an iceberg that would test every bit of grit and resolve I possessed. I'm Gabriel Miller, a man with a storied past and a name that carried more weight in certain circles than I'd ever wanted to admit. By profession, I'm a federal prosecutor, one known for taking down corrupt officials and exposing fraudulent corporations. Yet here I was, standing on the edge of my family's ranch in rural Wyoming, my heart pounding with a helpless mix of fury and disbelief. My father had passed away 5 years prior. He left me the ranch with a gentle request to keep our legacy alive. Now that legacy was threatened by an organization that, at first glance, looked more like a group of overzealous property developers than a typical neighborhood HOA. The mere presence of that billboard felt like an insult to my father's memory. It also felt like a direct challenge to me personally, and I was no man to turn away from such a challenge. I stepped closer to the site, feeling the rumble of machinery under my boots, hearing the hollers of workers who seemed completely oblivious to the fact that they were, as far as I was concerned, trespassing. When I asked for the person in charge, a tall woman in an immaculate navy suit emerged from behind a stack of building materials. She stood out like a peacock among pigeons, wearing an air of authority that suggested she believed this land was hers to command. She introduced herself as Madison Reeves, president of the Pleasant Trails HOA. I almost burst out laughing at the irony of pleasant in the name of an organization that was so blatantly disregarding property boundaries. Yet her expression was no joke. Her icy blue eyes locked onto mine with a confidence I found unnerving. There was no apology in her stance, no humility, just a keen sort of calculation. She basically told me they had all the permits they needed and that my family's ranch was now part of a planned expansion. My shock flickered into controlled rage. I demanded to see those permits. She refused with a polite but rigid smile. I suspected there was more to her story, and to her power, than met the eye. Over the next few hours, I tried to halt the construction with words alone. I threatened them with a lawsuit, threatened to call the sheriff, threatened everything short of a full-blown confrontation. Madison's reaction was calm, almost bored. She produced a stack of HOA documents, alleged legal notices, and a battered binder brimming with official-looking letters. She gestured to some pages while explaining that they had notified the owners of record months ago, but no one responded. The insinuation was that I was negligent, that I had somehow waived my right to protest by remaining silent. Part of me wondered if there had been some bureaucratic loophole or a failure in the local property records. Yet something smelled rotten. Perhaps it was the fact that none of my neighbors, some living half a mile down the road, had known anything about these condos. Or maybe it was that letterhead on each document carried the seal of the local mayor's office and a signature I recognized. Let's just say I'd come across that signature in certain investigations before. At the time, I never dreamed it would resurface in my personal life. The entire situation reeked of corruption and collusion. I walked away from the construction zone that afternoon seething, plotting my next move. The simplest path would be to file a restraining order in the local court. But the cynic in me suspected there was more behind Madison's tranquil self-assurance than just good luck. Before I took any formal steps, I needed to gather information. I had to do it quietly, systematically, to avoid alerting them to my real capabilities. You see, only a handful of people in town actually knew my job title and record. Most viewed me as that city boy who visits the ranch occasionally. They didn't realize I'd spent years prosecuting white-collar criminals who used the same type of shell games and forged paperwork, now threatening to swallow my inheritance. A little anonymity in my own hometown was a shield, one that would let me poke around without tipping off the HOA. So I began making calls, reaching out to old friends in the county clerk's office, carefully asking them about any recent property acquisitions or zoning changes. With each new piece of information, the bigger picture sharpened, and it was bigger than I dared to imagine. By the end of that week, I discovered that Pleasant Trails HOA had indeed expanded aggressively throughout our county in the past 2 years. Buying land, absorbing smaller neighborhood associations, and even taking over the local municipal utility board. They weren't a typical HOA, dealing with petty fines for overgrown lawns or misaligned mailboxes. They were a sprawling behemoth with a labyrinth of subsidiaries. Madison Reeves was rumored to have influential connections with city officials and possibly even people at the state level. While the specifics were fuzzy, one thing became clear. Money was changing hands in a suspiciously efficient way. Many documents were signed off late at night by the local mayor, a man I'd once interrogated in a federal corruption case but never charged due to lack of evidence. It seemed the lack of evidence might have been replaced by fresh opportunities for him to line his pockets at the expense of honest citizens. Amid these discoveries, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. I should have visited the ranch more often, should have maintained clearer oversight of local records. But I had been consumed by my career, chasing the bigger sharks in major cities, and now a local piranha was nibbling away at my own backyard. That sense of personal failure drove me to dig deeper. I called my mother, who lived in a retirement community a few states away, to see if she'd received any letters or notices. She was bewildered by the very question and said she'd heard nothing. My father's old attorney, a long-retired man who spent half the year traveling, was also clueless. He seemed offended at the thought that someone could slip a real estate takeover under his nose, but that's precisely what had happened. My inquiries led me to several residents who'd been steamrolled by the Pleasant Trails HOA's manipulative tactics. One of them, an older gentleman named Carlos Ramirez, recounted how he was forced to sell his small orchard on the edge of town after the association nearly bankrupted him with nuisance fines for landscaping violations. Another local, Marjorie Thomas, described how her home's water supply was mysteriously cut off until she relented and signed an agreement to join the. Their stories were eerily similar: escalating pressure, fabricated code violations, and abrupt offers to purchase the land. This was not just some random real estate deal, it was a systematic campaign of intimidation and exploitation. The longer I listened, the more convinced I became that Madison Reeves was the linchpin of this entire operation, the architect orchestrating a massive land grab under the guise of residential development. The moral outrage boiling within me was intense, but I also felt a twinge of excitement. This was precisely the sort of injustice I had been trained to dismantle. However, I had to tread carefully. If I initiated a high-profile legal confrontation at this stage, the HOA could shuffle its assets, destroy evidence, or otherwise vanish behind a corporate shell before the authorities moved in. I needed them to remain unaware of my full capacity. I was determined to strike at just the right moment, ensuring they had no escape route. In the meantime, my ranch was still crawling with workers. Every day the skeletons of the 42 condos grew taller, each new frame a slap in the face to my family's legacy. But I had no choice except to watch and gather intelligence. The emotional toll was significant. I remember standing by the old barn at dusk, running my fingers along the aged wooden beams my grandfather had hammered in place decades ago. I recalled the stories he shared about the hardships of building a life on this land during the Great Depression. The weight of that history felt unbearable as I witnessed an uninvited army ravaging the soil he'd cherished. One evening I came across an old trunk in the attic of the main house. It contained letters, property deeds, and personal notes from multiple ancestors who had owned the ranch over the centuries. These documents highlighted the land's unique environmental and historical value. It encompassed a creek that served as a wildlife corridor, along with a patch of endangered plant species. If the HOA's project continued, the local ecosystem would be irreversibly damaged. In my line of work, I'd seen companies pay lip service to environmental regulations before. Madison's group was no different. An environmental impact statement so thick with bureaucratic jargon that it would make your head spin had been swiftly approved. Whether it was bribery or just deeply flawed oversight, the effect was the same. The ranch was headed for environmental ruin. Even so, I set the trunk aside, aware these personal mementos had fueled my emotional drive, but also aware my case would need hard, verifiable evidence of wrongdoing. Nostalgic letters alone wouldn't be enough to bring the hammer of justice down on the entire HOA. That weekend, I decided to confront Madison directly to see if I could glean more information from her. Strolling into their makeshift site office, a large white trailer perched near the once lush orchard, I found her flipping through a thick folder of paperwork. She greeted me with a perfunctory nod, not the least bit rattled by my presence. I played the role of an annoyed but relatively powerless landowner, demanding an explanation for their blatant intrusion. She countered with a veneer of politeness. "We've followed all legal processes, Mr. Miller. If you have a complaint, file it with the county." Her words dripped with condescension, but what stood out most was her absolute confidence. She didn't see me as a threat. Instead, she saw me as an irrelevant obstacle, one she could simply crush under a stack of legal documents. That assumption would be her Achilles heel, and I intended to exploit it. She revealed in a moment of casual arrogance that the mayor was one of her biggest supporters. I acted surprised, even though it merely confirmed my suspicions. "I'm sure you're aware your father's ranch was slated for rezoning well before you took over," she added, eyes sparkling with triumph. There it was, a hint that my father's death had opened a door for them to manipulate local officials into passing that rezoning measure. I demanded to see a formal notice of this rezoning. She waved a dismissive hand and promised to send the documents to me when the time was right. Our conversation ended with her politely escorting me out of the trailer, as though I were some bothersome reporter snooping around for a story. That performance solidified my plan. She had no clue who I really was, or what I was capable of. Later that night, I made a series of phone calls to trusted colleagues in the FBI and Department of Justice. While I was a federal prosecutor, certain protocols had to be followed before launching any formal investigation. I needed a green light, or at least some preliminary backing to begin collecting evidence with the weight of a federal probe behind me. My superiors, familiar with my track record, gave me a cautious nod. They knew I wouldn't waste resources on a personal vendetta unless real criminal activity was involved. Armed with that tacit approval, I quietly assembled a small team of investigators I'd worked with on past corruption cases. We planned to use financial forensics, wiretaps, with judicial authorization, and document subpoenas to expose the full extent of the HOA's wrongdoing. It was an unconventional route. Typically, local property disputes don't escalate to the federal level. But if there was evidence of mail fraud, racketeering, or bribery, it would be fair game for federal prosecution, and from what I'd seen, Pleasant Trail's HOA was knee-deep in at least two of those categories. As I put the investigative wheels in motion, my personal life took a hard hit. The constant tension of seeing my land ravaged by construction, coupled with my mother calling to express her heartbreak, weighed heavily on me. I found myself pacing the old farmhouse at odd hours. The smell of sawdust, once comforting, now replaced by the reek of asphalt and industrial chemicals from the site. The spiritual assault on our family heritage was relentless, but ironically, it also gave me an unbreakable determination. Every steel girder hammered into the ground, every chunk of earth carved away, was a reminder of what I stood to lose and what I needed to protect. My duty wasn't just to avenge a personal wrong. It was to hold an entire organization accountable for preying on countless people in my community. My first significant breakthrough arrived in the form of a whistleblower. Late one afternoon, while I was surveying the damage near the creek, a young construction worker approached me. Nervously looking over his shoulder, he asked if I was the ranch owner. I nodded warily. He said his name was Kevin, and he was disgusted by what he called the underhanded deals going on behind the scenes. He had overheard conversations between Madison and the mayor about forging environmental clearance certificates and paying off local inspectors to fast-track the condo project. He also had emails to prove it. In exchange for some legal protection, he was willing to share everything he knew. My heart pounded with excitement. This was precisely the thread that could unravel the entire operation. I took his details, assured him that I could keep him anonymous for as long as possible, and told him I would be in touch. As I watched him disappear into the dimming light, I silently thanked fate for bringing him to me at exactly the right moment. The next day, I brought Kevin's evidence to my investigative team. The emails were as damning as he promised. Clear references to bribery, false permits, and complicity from certain local officials. One message even referred to keeping the ranch problem under control. If that wasn't a direct link to malicious intent, I didn't know what was. My colleagues were stunned at the scale. This was more than just a rogue HOA project. It was a ring of corruption involving real estate moguls, local politicians, and possibly higher-level functionaries. The sense of urgency multiplied. We needed to move fast before they realized they had a mole in their ranks. In parallel, I meticulously documented every fence post, every uprooted tree, and every pile of construction material that had invaded my land. I snapped photographs, took soil samples, and captured videos of the day-to-day operations. My father's old camera still worked. Ironically, he had used it to document the ranch's progress over the years, never imagining it would one day be used to record its destruction. Each piece of evidence felt like a small victory, but it was the legal puzzle that I found most compelling. How to connect these local crimes to broader federal statutes. My years of experience taught me that criminals often slip up when they try to launder illegal funds, or when they commit fraud via mail and electronic communications. Sure enough, one of Madison's biggest blunders was sending multiple letters threatening property seizures through the U.S. Postal Service. That alone opened a door to mail fraud charges, and with the bribes rumored to cross state lines, we had potential for interstate racketeering. This HOA was about to face the wrath of federal law, and they had no idea it was coming. Between the sleepless nights and frenetic days, I also had to balance the emotional turmoil of seeing my ancestral land devoured by unstoppable machines. My neighbors noticed I wasn't the same laid-back man they remembered. They saw the intensity in my eyes and the seriousness in my demeanor. Some confided in me about their own fears of being forced off their property. They described receiving threatening letters from the Pleasant Trails HOA, claiming that if they didn't join, they'd lose utility services or face enormous fines. Many of them had families to support and felt powerless. Their stories fueled my resolve further. I was not just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for an entire community that had been coerced into silence. I confronted the mayor in his office one afternoon, a meeting carefully orchestrated so I could record the conversation with a hidden device. He was a sweaty, middle-aged man who seemed unnerved by my presence. I kept my tone polite but firm, inquiring about the rezoning approval for my ranch and the rumored payments he might be receiving from the HOA. He stammered through half-hearted denials, then tried to spin a tale about how the development would bring much-needed revenue and jobs to the county. I pressed harder. He finally admitted the county was having financial issues and needed public-public partnerships. His desperation was palpable, but he never directly admitted to receiving bribes. At least, not in that meeting. Nonetheless, every slip of his tongue, every pause, was carefully recorded. My next step would be to confront him with undeniable evidence, but only after my team had enough to lock him in a corner. For now, I let him sweat, walking away with an air of disappointment. Madison Reeves' fortress of lies had cracks in its foundation, and each conversation I had with complicit officials only widened those cracks. Around this time, the emotional stakes of my situation skyrocketed when my mother decided to fly in for a surprise visit. She hadn't seen the ranch in years and was utterly devastated by the sight of bulldozers ripping through what was once a serene landscape. She broke down in tears when she saw how the orchard where she used to gather apples with my father was reduced to stumps. I held her tight, promising that I would right this wrong. that I would make sure Dad's dream wouldn't die under the weight of concrete slabs and corporate greed. My mother's heartbreak reminded me of all the cherished moments my family had built on this land. This was no longer just another case. It was personal in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The lines between my duty as a federal prosecutor and my role as a guardian of my family's heritage were blurred beyond distinction, but if anything, that only made me more determined. The final push toward confrontation came when I discovered a trove of financial transactions linking the Pleasant Trails HOA to multiple shell companies. Each shell company tied back to the same small group of real estate investors, who in turn had donated heavily to the mayor's re-election campaign. The sums were staggering, enough to make it obvious that no single HOA could generate that kind of money through regular membership fees. This was large-scale corruption. Meanwhile, Kevin's intel revealed that Madison was meeting regularly with a certain state senator, allegedly to expedite environmental clearances for her various projects. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. I spent sleepless nights organizing the data into a cohesive narrative for an eventual grand jury presentation. My investigators and I had enough to blow the lid off not just the local scandal, but possibly a statewide conspiracy. Every day the condo frames rose higher, but so did my conviction that the time to strike was near. And yet there was an undercurrent of doubt gnawing at me. What if stopping construction meant tearing apart the livelihood of innocent workers or small contractors who weren't aware of the HOA's corrupt foundation? This question haunted me, bringing out the moral conflict I had long buried under my professional veneer. Was I willing to see them all jobless just to protect a piece of land? My inner turmoil simmered until I realized that real justice meant punishing the true criminals. Madison, the mayor, and anyone else profiteering off this scheme, not the people hired to do a job under false pretenses. That clarity helped me sleep a little easier. It also strengthened my resolve to build the case in such a way that spared innocent parties as much as possible. Finally, I organized a secret community meeting in the barn behind my ranch house, ironically right under the nose of the condo construction site. About 20 concerned residents showed up, each fearful of the HOA's possible retaliation. The tension in the air was palpable. Hushed voices, sideways glances, and tearful accounts of intimidation. One by one, they confirmed the same pattern of harassment. Surprise fines, forced membership, backdoor deals with local officials. With their permission, I collected sworn statements detailing their experiences. I vowed to protect their identities as much as the law allowed. The sense of unity in that barn was profound. It felt as though we were forging a small rebellion against a powerful tyrant. By the end of the night, each attendee left with a sense of hope they hadn't felt in months. Though they didn't fully know my position as a federal prosecutor, they recognized that I had the will and the means to bring the fight. Shortly after that meeting, I decided the time had come to reveal my true identity to Madison Reeves. Perhaps it was a bit theatrical, but I needed her rattled. I made sure to arrive at the construction site just as a group of investors was touring the progress. Tucking my official credentials into the inner pocket of my blazer, I approached Madison in full view of her associates. My eyes locked on hers. I noticed a flicker of annoyance that I had come uninvited. With a calm but firm tone, I said, "Madison Reeves, my name is Gabriel Miller. I'm a federal prosecutor assigned to a special corruption task force. I have enough evidence to place you and your entire organization under investigation for racketeering, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit bribery." The color drained from her face as her meticulously crafted composure wavered. She glanced nervously at the investors, who began to exchange worried looks. One even tried to slip away, but an officer from my team stepped in to block him. To my surprise, Madison didn't launch into an immediate denial. Instead, she tried to appeal to reason, speaking in hurried whispers so the investors wouldn't overhear her every word. "This is a misunderstanding," she hissed, sweat beading on her forehead. "We have all the permits. Everything we did was by the book." I snapped back, "Your book might be different from the federal code, Ms. Reeves, especially when every third page is a payoff to a local official." She looked on the brink of panic, but she had the arrogance to add, You can't just shut us down. You'll ruin countless families who already invested in these condos. Her attempt to guilt-trip me fell flat. You've already ruined families by coercing them off their land, I retorted, maintaining an unyielding stare. Your investors will have to deal with the consequences of aligning themselves with a corrupt operation. The next hour was a flurry of hushed arguments, calls to lawyers, and desperate attempts to hide or destroy evidence. But my team had anticipated this. We had court orders ready to freeze bank accounts, seize documents, and bar further construction until the case was resolved. County sheriff deputies soon arrived to enforce the stop work order, leading stunned construction workers away from their stations. As we escorted Madison out of the site, local news cameras caught wind of the commotion and reporters swarmed in. The once pristine public image of Pleasant Trail's HOA was demolished in a single afternoon. Madison glared at me with a venomous hatred, but she had no escape. In that moment, I felt a pang of empathy for her misguided ambition. She had wanted power and wealth so badly that she was willing to steamroll entire communities to get it. Now, she was about to face a criminal indictment that could send her to prison for a very long time. Over the following weeks, the investigation ballooned into a multi-state probe. My mother watched the news daily, a mix of relief and sorrow tugging at her heart. Relief that our family ranch had been saved from immediate destruction, sorrow for the damage already done. Bulldozers had torn up half the orchard. A portion of the creek was polluted with runoff, and the historic barns needed repairs due to vibration damage from the heavy machinery. The local ecosystem, once bustling with wildlife, had retreated in confusion and fear. Yet in the midst of all this loss, our victory shone through. Thanks to the evidence collected from whistleblowers like Kevin, the testimony of brave residents who had come forward, and the official documents seized in the raid, the U.S. Attorney's Office was able to file charges against multiple parties. The mayor abruptly resigned in disgrace, several local officials were arrested, and a state senator found himself under intense scrutiny for his backroom deals. Madison Reeves, the unwavering face of the Pleasant Trails HOA, was exposed as the mastermind behind the entire racket. She fought the charges vigorously, hiring a legal dream team, but the evidence was stacked so high that even the best lawyers in the state struggled to mount a defense. During the months leading up to her trial, the community began to heal. Neighbors banded together, helping each other clear debris, replant lost trees, and reclaim the sense of unity that had been fractured by fear. The press took a keen interest in my role as a federal prosecutor who had turned his professional tools on a personal conflict. Some labeled me a hero, others questioned the ethics of using my position to resolve a private land dispute, but those voices quieted as more details emerged about the HOA's extensive criminal network. In the end, the moral imperative to stop corruption far outweighed any notion of conflict of interest. The people recognized that if I hadn't stepped in, the entire county might have been consumed by the unholy alliance between greedy developers and corrupt politicians. When the trial finally began, the courthouse brimmed with journalists, curious locals, and anxious property owners whose futures hinged on this verdict. I took the stand, presenting my investigations and evidence with the calm, methodical precision I had honed over years of prosecuting high-stakes cases. Madison tried to maintain her poise, dressed in a subdued charcoal suit, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Each damning piece of evidence chipped away at her facade, and each witness recounted a personal horror story that stained her reputation further. By the trial's second week, her defense team resorted to every legal trick in the book, challenging the legitimacy of search warrants, questioning the credibility of whistleblowers, but the paper trail was too damning. Financial records, email communications, and her own signature on forged documents told a story more compelling than any defense argument could refute. In a final twist, Kevin took the stand and recounted in detail the hushed conversations he had overheard, explaining how Madison orchestrated bribes with local officials by transferring funds through shell companies. His calm testimony stunned the courtroom. Madison's lead attorney looked like he was ready to crawl under the counsel's table. The jury's faces reflected shock and growing indignation. The day the verdict came, you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. One by one, the jury members declared her guilty on multiple counts. She flinched each time the word guilty was repeated, as if every count were a physical blow. The judge revoked her bail, ordering her straight into custody. The crowd outside erupted in cheers as news spread that justice had prevailed. For me, the moment was oddly bittersweet. I had fought tooth and nail to protect my family's ranch and expose a corrupt enterprise, yet the damage to our land was not so easily undone. Still, the sense of vindication for my father's memory, knowing that the bullies who profaned his ranch had been punished, was indescribably powerful. In the aftermath, the Pleasant Trails HOA splintered, and the new leadership offered to pay restitution to those who had been harmed by the illegal developments. My neighbors cautiously accepted these reparations, using the funds to repair homes, replant fields, and restore property lines. The orchard on my ranch was partially salvaged, though it will take years to fully recover. Environmental experts were brought in to repair the creek's ecosystem, and volunteer groups banded together for reforestation efforts. A sense of communal renewal filled the air, though the scars remained, visible in the unfinished condo structures that would likely be demolished. Life persevered. The community, once fractured, discovered a newfound solidarity born from shared struggle. My mother eventually went home, comforted that our family legacy remained intact despite the bruises. She told me that Dad would have been proud, and I believed her. I stayed behind to oversee the ranch's restoration, determined to bring it as close to its former glory as possible. Sometimes, at night, I'd stand near the skeletal frames of those abandoned condos and let the cool Wyoming wind brush against my face. I reflected on the cost of this victory, both for me personally and for the townspeople. The echoes of bulldozers still haunted my dreams. But I took solace in the knowledge that justice had been served, and that perhaps a new generation could grow up here without ever having to fear a powerful organization swooping in to take what was theirs. My father's dream was still alive, tenuous but real, woven together by the unwavering will of a family and a community that refused to bow to corruption. Throughout this ordeal, I learned that righteousness sometimes demands you walk a razor's edge between personal grief and professional obligation. I discovered that beneath the quiet surface of a small American town, entire worlds of deceit could flourish if left unchecked. And I found my own strength tested in ways I never anticipated. In the end, the ranch endured. My family's legacy remained standing after facing the storm. The Pleasant Trails HOA discovered that greed and power can only shield you for so long before the truth catches up, and they learned, in the harshest way possible, that I wasn't just a grieving son or a naive landowner. I was a feared federal prosecutor, with a community's welfare and a family's honor fueling my every move. Now, as the sun sets behind the horizon, the ranch breathes easier. The monstrous roar of construction has vanished. Grass begins to reclaim the barren patches where heavy machinery once crushed the soil. My neighbors stop by in the evenings, dropping off homemade pies, jars of preserves, or just a friendly word of encouragement. We talk about building new fences or establishing a shared farmers market. Children play along the winding creek, giggling at frogs they find along the bank. And in those sounds, the hum of laughter, the flow of water, the rustling of wind through leaves, I hear the heartbeat of this land, steady and strong. Peace returns to the place my father called home for decades. His spirit lingers in the old barn, in the orchard's resilient shoots, in the quiet corners of the farmhouse. And though the memory of bulldozers still shadows my thoughts, I remind myself that the fight was worth it. This ranch is more than acreage and timber. It's a testament to an unbreakable spirit, a refuge in a world where greed and corruption often run rampant. Yet here, for now, the good guys have won. And as for those who dared to cross that line, well, they have no escape.